She was found beneath the earth, clutching a diary no one was meant to read. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Let's grow this mystery-loving circle. Comment where you're watching from. Your words fuel this journey. I'm eager to hear from you. Let's begin. It was the sort of autumn London morning that seemed to arrive already weary. A greying drizzle fell in whispering sheets across Baker Street, softening the gaslight glow and cloaking every figure in a mantle of ambiguity. The hansoms hissed along wet cobblestones and chimneys wept smoke into a sky too tired to protest. I was poring over the medical column of the Times, a cup of cooling coffee at my elbow, when the door to our sitting room flew open with a kind of theatrical urgency that could only belong to one man. "My dear Watson," Holmes announced, striding in and discarding his coat in a single fluid motion. "You must accompany me to Highgate. There is a matter of most unusual urgency that demands our attention, though I fear Lestrade has already blundered into it with both boots." I looked up from the paper. Highgate Cemetery? Has some body risen from the grave and begun haunting Parliament? "Worse," Holmes said, pausing only to stuff his pipe with tobacco. "A woman has been buried with a diary in her arms, and someone is most anxious that its contents never see the light of day." The facts, as Holmes relayed them on our journey north, were as follows. 3 days prior, a Mrs. Eugenia Ashcroft, widow of the late Lord Edwin Ashcroft, had been interred at Highgate in the family mausoleum. Nothing about her death, nor the simple Anglican service, had aroused suspicion. It was a quiet affair, attended only by a scattering of distant relatives and the family solicitor. But on the morning following her burial, the groundskeeper had discovered the door to the Ashcroft tomb ajar, though the lock showed no sign of force. Naturally, Scotland Yard had been summoned, and Inspector Lestrade, with his characteristic blend of thoroughness and obtuseness, had inspected the scene. No body had been taken, no object appeared missing, save for one detail noted by the mortician's assistant, a young man named Clark. According to him, the deceased had been laid to rest with a small leather-bound volume clutched in her hands. When the tomb was examined, the book was gone. "I hardly see what could be criminal in that," I said, as our cab turned up Swain's Lane. "A superstitious family member might have thought it improper to bury a diary with the dead. A sentimental act, not a felonious one." "Your instinct is charitable, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the fog-veiled cemetery gates as they came into view. "But you neglect to ask why the diary was placed there in the first place, and why someone would risk scandal to retrieve it in the dead of night." The cemetery was cloaked in a melancholy. Yew trees loomed like frozen mourners, and the worn paths coiled between crooked gravestones. The mausoleums stood like small Roman temples, their facades stained with soot in the passage of time. A constable stood guard at the Ashcroft tomb, a moss-dark structure half recessed into the hill. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with his usual forced politeness, and a scowl that deepened when Holmes began his circuit without a word of acknowledgement. "Nothing stolen, no tracks, no witnesses," Lestrade said, clearly agitated. "I'll not waste the Yard's time on ghost stories." Holmes bent low to examine the lintel of the tomb, drawing a magnifying lens from his pocket. "Ghost stories rarely leave boot polish on stone, Inspector, but then neither do the deceased." I knelt beside him. "What is it?" Holmes pointed to a faint smudge, no larger than a thumbprint, near the edge of the iron gate. "Fresh polish? And there." He directed my gaze to the inside step of the tomb where a tiny fragment of damp fabric clung to the stone. "Blue wool? Lady's glove, I suspect." Lestrade snorted. "So a lady entered the tomb to steal a diary. What of it?" "No proof the diary even existed. Clark may be mistaken." Holmes stood. If Clark was mistaken, then why did someone try to bribe him yesterday? That caught even Lestrade off guard. "What?" Clark was approached by a stranger at the mortuary, offered £10 for a detailed description of what was buried with the body. Clark refused, and the man vanished. Lestrade's brow furrowed. He never reported it. "Because no one took him seriously, until I did," Holmes replied. A quiet voice broke the tension. "Then you believe me?" We turned. A young man stood beside the wrought iron fence, no more than 20, pale and earnest, in a threadbare overcoat. He looked as if he'd scarcely slept. "I'm Clark," he said. "I knew it wasn't right, sir. The diary wasn't ordinary." Holmes gestured. "Tell us what you know." "It was small," Clark said. "Bound in red leather. I didn't read it, but she was holding it close, almost cradling it. Her fingers were ink-stained, even in death. And there was something else. The title page had a single line. I saw it when I adjusted her hands." He swallowed. It said, "For the one who knows the truth." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes leaned against the fireplace, silent for several minutes, his violin untouched on the table beside him. "This is not merely a matter of grave robbing," he said at last. "This is a game of concealment, of something the late Mrs. Ashcroft meant to confess beyond death, and which someone living fears too much to allow. And what shall we do?" Holmes turned to me, eyes alight. "We shall find the diary, Watson. But first, we must find the woman who entered the tomb." He tapped the blue wool fragment between his fingers. "And I believe she wears gloves of Prussian blue, trimmed with lace, and resides somewhere in Bloomsbury." "How on earth?" I began. Holmes merely smiled. "All in good time." Holmes was up before dawn the next morning, which in my long acquaintance with the man was almost always a signal of some fierce internal ignition, some flame sparked by the friction of reason against riddle. When I came downstairs, he had already donned a neatly tailored grey suit, a walking stick in one hand, and in the other, a slim envelope sealed with wax. "Watson," he said crisply, "your breakfast is under the cloche. I've written to Miss Violet Kenworthy at No. 9 Bloomsbury Square and requested the pleasure of her company under the most civil of pretenses. She is to believe I am conducting a historical study of the Ashcroft lineage. You will accompany me, naturally, but speak only when I direct. This is a house where words are likely weighed before they are welcomed." I blinked, still adjusting to the early hour. "Who is Miss Kenworthy, and how have you deduced her involvement?" He allowed himself the faintest smile. "Let us say the gloves told me all I needed to know. Prussian blue wool, lace trimmed with a faint trace of hyacinth perfume. A scent popular only at Galloway's on Longacre, and primarily among women who frequent the literary salons around Russell Square. Miss Kenworthy is a noted essayist on Victorian domesticity, and more to the point, was the late Eugenia Ashcroft's companion for nearly 6 years. She gave a reading at the Ladies' Club just last fortnight, wearing, yes, a pair of blue gloves with lace at the wrist. Lestrade dismisses coincidence. I do not. By 8:30 we were walking beneath the skeletal trees of Bloomsbury, their branches like arthritic fingers scratching at the morning mist. The houses here wore a respectable decay, dignified but dim, with curtains drawn too carefully and doormen who nodded without ever seeing. No. 9 was a narrow house, faced in pale stone, a brass knocker polished to a fault. A maid, unsmiling and flaxen-haired, admitted us and took Holmes's card without comment. We were shown to a drawing-room lined with books, the fireplace trimmed in white marble. A vase of hyacinths stood on the escritoire. Miss Kenworthy entered a moment later. She was in her mid-30s, I should say. Plain of face, but not unpleasant, her bearing neat as a ledger. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and modulated, with the cadence of one who has taught herself to erase emotion from her speech. "You are the detective, Mr. Holmes," she said, accepting his hand without warmth. "And this must be your chronicler. I've read the account of your case with the engineer's thumb. Vivid, if a bit theatrical. "Dr. Watson, at your service," I said politely. Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Kenworthy, forgive the subterfuge. We are not, in fact, conducting a genealogical survey. We are investigating the desecration of the Ashcroft tomb. I believe you may have information critical to resolving the matter." Her eyes did not widen, but the slightest tightening of the mouth betrayed her surprise. She folded her hands calmly in her lap. "You presume I was involved?" "I do," Holmes replied evenly. "You entered the tomb late on the night of the burial. You took the diary from Mrs. Ashcroft's arms, and then, I believe, you attempted to convince Mr. Clark to forget he ever saw it." The silence in the room thickened. Outside, a milk cart clattered by on the square's cobbles. Miss Kenworthy stared at Holmes, and for a moment I thought she might cry or strike him, but neither occurred. "I did enter the tomb," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I did not steal. I reclaimed." Holmes gestured for her to continue. She stood abruptly, crossing to the fire, her hands pressed to the mantel. Mrs. Ashcroft was no mad old woman, as the papers might suggest. She was deliberate, intelligent, and terrified. That diary was not merely her musings. It was her confession, but not of a crime, of a knowledge too dangerous to survive her. I stepped forward. "Dangerous to whom?" She turned. "To the man who now controls the Ashcroft estate. His name is Silas Grange. Technically a cousin, though the family tree was bent in too many directions to explain. He was employed by Lord Edwin Ashcroft to manage certain foreign investments in Egypt and India. But the truth, as Mrs. Ashcroft discovered, was that Silas was draining the family funds, falsifying ledgers, and, if her suspicions are to be believed, arranging two very convenient accidents that removed witnesses to his fraud." Holmes's eyes narrowed. And why would she wait until her death to reveal this? Because she had no proof that would hold in a court of law. Only observations. Conversations overheard, documents glimpsed and then disappeared. She feared her name would be discredited while she lived. But she believed that a diary, kept meticulously and discovered after death, might carry the weight of a dying declaration. "And yet you removed it." She turned sharply. "Yes, because I feared what he would do if he got to it first, and I was right. 2 nights ago, someone searched this very room. They overturned every drawer, opened every book, slit open the cushions. I found a half-burnt match by the window, still bearing the crest of the Albion Hotel, where Silas Grange has been staying these past weeks." Holmes's face remained unreadable, but he moved to the desk and tapped a silver frame. "And where is the diary now?" "I placed it with a solicitor I trust," she said. "Mr. Linwood, of Clement's Inn. He has instructions to release it only if I'm harmed or if Mr. Grange attempts to leave the country." "And have you informed the police?" She gave a bitter laugh. "Inspector Lestrade all but called me a hysteric, told me not to waste his time unless someone turned up dead." Holmes picked up his gloves. "Then we must speak to Mr. Linwood immediately. If Grange suspects what you've done, he may act with greater boldness than you expect." As we departed, Miss Kenworthy gripped Holmes's sleeve. "You believe me, don't you?" Holmes looked at her with a rare flicker of gentleness. "I believe you are in very real danger, Miss Kenworthy, and I believe the dead have already told us more than the living wish to confess." We walked briskly toward Chancery Lane as the fog began to lift from the rooftops. Holmes lit a cigarette and spoke without looking at me. "Note, Watson, how carefully this was staged. A woman buried with a diary, a tomb left unlocked but not vandalized, a companion who removes a document under cover of night, and a man with both motive and means circling like a vulture." "But why not destroy the diary before the funeral?" I asked. "Because he didn't know it existed. Mrs. Ashcroft, it seems, was cleverer than he gave her credit for, and now, I suspect, Mr. Grange will make a final attempt. One not of retrieval, but of silence." "And we?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "We shall make certain that the truth is heard before the grave swallows it a second time." We reached Clement's Inn by 11:30. the fog thinning to a pallid veil through which the sun made no sincere effort to shine. The building that housed Mr. Linwood's practice was a narrow brick affair tucked among a procession of legal offices, its windows as expressionless as the clerks inside. Holmes ascended the steps with that peculiar combination of urgency and elegance that always reminded me of a fencer entering the ring. I followed, still reflecting on Miss Kenworthy's revelations, the weight of her conviction clinging to my thoughts like dew on a morning coat. Mr. Archibald Linwood received us in a small, high-ceilinged office that smelled faintly of leather and coal dust. He was a thin man with prematurely white hair, pince-nez perched on the end of a beakish nose, and a temperament that seemed permanently aligned with discretion. When Holmes introduced himself, the solicitor's lips tightened into a thin horizontal line, as though recalling some distasteful precedent. "You are here regarding the diary of Mrs. Eugenia Ashcroft," Linwood said without preamble. "Miss Kenworthy wrote to me yesterday, indicating she had handed it over in trust, but I received no further instructions to release or surrender the item. I presume she has not been harmed?" "Not yet," Holmes said calmly, removing his gloves. "But we believe that is only a matter of time. There has already been an attempted search of her home, presumably by Mr. Silas Grange. I should like to see the diary at once." Linwood hesitated, steepling his fingers. "I do not typically oblige requests made by private detectives, however renowned, but Miss Kenworthy did grant me full discretion in an emergency. I will permit you to examine the diary under supervision, but it must remain in my custody unless conditions necessitate otherwise." Holmes inclined his head. "That is acceptable." The solicitor unlocked a drawer in his desk and retrieved a slender bundle wrapped in oilcloth. When unwrapped, it revealed a red leather volume, weathered at the corners, but intact. It was tied with a narrow ribbon of black silk. The sight of it was oddly arresting, as though the air itself recoiled slightly from its presence. Holmes laid the diary gently on the desk and untied the ribbon. The first page, as Clark had described, bore a single line: "For the one who knows the truth." He turned the pages slowly, scanning entries written in a tight, angular hand. I stood beside him, catching fragments of Mrs. Ashcroft's voice in her prose, controlled, precise, but trembling with unease beneath the surface. April 3rd. Silas has returned from Bombay. Edwin still trusts him, but I sense something oily beneath his courtesy. He dines too frequently with that dreadful Mr. Pevensey, the banker. They whisper over port like conspirators. May 9th. I found the letters again. Silas has been forging Edwin's name. I fear there are entire accounts Edwin does not even know exist. I cannot confront him yet. June 1st. Another accident. The steward who warned me last month has drowned while crossing the channel. A coincidence, they say. I no longer believe in such things. Holmes paused, his finger resting on the edge of a torn page. "Watson, observe. Here, just before June 15th, an entry has been removed. Torn cleanly, not carelessly. I'd wager it was the last entry before her final collapse." Linwood cleared his throat. "Miss Kenworthy mentioned Mrs. Ashcroft took ill shortly after June. She had a fainting episode in Hyde Park and was bedridden intermittently thereafter. No doctors found a decisive cause." "Possibly no physical cause to find?" Holmes murmured. If she had concluded that Silas Grange was behind 2 deaths already, her mind may have succumbed to fear more than illness. I leaned forward, intrigued. But this missing page, why take only one? Holmes closed the diary and retied the ribbon. Because it must contain the singular statement that proved fatal to someone's sense of safety. A name, a location, or a transaction that tied Grange too closely to one of the deaths. He may not know what she wrote, only that she wrote something, and now he's desperate to recover or destroy it. At that moment, the clerk entered quietly and placed a note in Linwood's hand. The solicitor scanned it, frowned, and passed it to Holmes. Mr. Linwood, it read, there is a gentleman asking to see you downstairs. He gives the name Silas Grange. Holmes snapped to his feet. We must assume he suspects the diary is here. If he sees us, we lose our advantage. Linwood, surprisingly quick, tucked the diary beneath a stack of ledgers. There is a servant's stair through the back, down to Fetter Lane. Quiet, but it exits into the open. I trust that will suffice? It will do, Holmes said. And Linwood, keep your office locked. If Mr. Grange insists upon seeing you, give him nothing. Moments later, we were slipping down a narrow flight of stairs lit only by a single high window. Holmes moved quickly, but without panic, his mind already shifting into its next configuration. Outside, the street was quiet, save for a fruit seller wheeling his cart and a constable tipping his hat in our direction. Holmes hailed a cab at once. To the Albion Hotel, he instructed. And driver, take Cheapside. I do not wish to be followed. As we rattled through the narrow lanes, I glanced over at him. Do you believe Grange will act against Linwood? Not at once. He's still hoping to bluff his way forward, to scare or confuse his enemies into surrendering the evidence. But when charm and threats fail, such men inevitably resort to violence. We must not allow that moment to arrive unprepared. When we arrived at the Albion, Holmes stepped into the lobby with the bearing of a barrister late for a hearing. The front desk clerk looked up, startled, as Holmes approached with authority. I am Mr. Michael Renfield, from the Colonial Office, he said, flashing a card I had never seen before and hoped never to explain. We are conducting a background check on a Silas Grange, presently residing here. His cooperation would be helpful, but discretion more so. The clerk paled slightly and nodded. Yes, sir. He's in suite 23. Second floor, front-facing. Shall I ring up? That won't be necessary. Moments later, we stood before the suite. Holmes pressed his ear to the door, then nodded. He's in. We shall not knock. Instead, and here Holmes produced a thin envelope and a blank sheet of paper. He wrote a single sentence. I know what the missing page says. Shall we speak before the police are involved? He folded it, addressed it simply to Mr. Silas Grange, and slid it beneath the door. We stepped back, concealing ourselves around the corner. Within seconds, we heard the rustle of footsteps, the pause, the rustle of paper being unfolded. Then, a curse. A chair scraped. A moment later, the lock turned, and Silas Grange stepped out. He was taller than I had imagined, immaculately dressed in a brown frock coat and a cravat tied with an almost theatrical flourish. His face was clean-shaven, smooth as polished glass, but his eyes darted like a man accustomed to both calculation and paranoia. Holmes stepped out. Mr. Grange. Grange froze. I believe you and I have much to discuss. Grange's face hardened. You've made a mistake, sir. Holmes smiled thinly. I hope so. But if not, well, I find it best to confront errors before the grave becomes crowded again. Grange hesitated only a moment, then gestured toward his room. Very well, let's talk. And with that, we entered the lair of a man who, Holmes would later say, had arranged more deaths with a fountain pen than most scoundrels manage with a blade. Grange's suite was handsomely appointed, with a view that overlooked Ludgate Hill and a writing desk placed neatly beside a window dressed in plum velvet. Everything in the room had a curious symmetry to it. Papers aligned perfectly, no book out of place, no object resting without clear intention. It was the sort of fastidiousness that suggests a man either deeply in control or desperately pretending to be. Holmes entered without hesitation, his hat still perched neatly on his head. I followed, and Grange closed the door behind us with a decisive click, though he made no move to offer us seats. You have something to say, Grange said coolly. His voice had the grain of polish, but his hands, carefully tucked behind his back, twitched slightly at the knuckles. Speak it quickly. Holmes stepped forward, his tone unhurried. Mrs. Ashcroft kept a diary. Grange raised an eyebrow but betrayed nothing. "You're aware of it, of course," Holmes continued. "You made efforts to locate it before the funeral. You bribed the mortuary clerk. You sent someone to search Miss Kenworthy's home." "Pure conjecture." "No," Holmes said, voice sharpened. "Pure deduction. A gentleman in a grey overcoat was seen loitering outside number 9 Bloomsbury Square the morning after the burial. He left behind a matchbook from this very hotel. Your matchbook. A minor oversight, unless one considers your known fondness for cigars and your unfortunate tendency to discard ash carelessly. You see, Mr. Grange, your sins are like soot, invisible to the eye at first, but impossible to clean completely." Grange's nostrils flared, but still he said nothing. He circled to the desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a cut crystal decanter. "Would you like a drink?" he asked, with mock civility. Holmes ignored the question. "Let us be frank. You don't yet know what was written on the diary's missing page. That terrifies you. You suspect it ties you to something fatal. Perhaps something involving Mr. Pevensey, or the Ashcroft accounts, or the steward who drowned mysteriously after alerting Mrs. Ashcroft to your theft." "I think," Grange said quietly, pouring a measure of whiskey into a glass, "that you have let a spinster's fancies seduce your reason. Eugenia Ashcroft was not a well woman in the final year of her life. She grew paranoid, withdrawn, endlessly scribbling in that wretched book. No court of law would accept her scribbles as evidence, nor should any man of logic. Yet you ransacked her companion's home to obtain those very scribbles," Holmes said, "and now you're here, circling the solicitor's office in case the diary surfaces. That is not the behavior of an innocent man." Grange placed the glass on the desk without tasting it. "Do you know how many parasites surround a noble family's fortune, Mr. Holmes? Companions, cousins, housekeepers with their little grievances and imagined slights. Miss Kenworthy has always resented me. She feared I would inherit more of the estate than she. This entire farce is the invention of a bitter woman. There was no theft, no fraud, only envy, cleverly weaponized. Then why did 2 men who suspected your conduct die under inexplicable circumstances?" Grange's mouth twitched into a tight smile. "Do you suspect I drowned a steward in the Channel, or pushed him from the ferry with my bare hands?" "No," Holmes said. "You hired someone else to do it, or arranged for his passage on a vessel known for its lax safety. But I imagine the details are beyond your willingness to confess." Grange stepped forward, his voice now low and deliberate. "Mr. Holmes, let me offer you something that your profession may value more than speculation. Certainty. I will make a sworn statement that I had no knowledge of the diary until Miss Kenworthy made her allegations. I will permit my personal papers to be reviewed by the family solicitors. I will even meet with the Ashcroft trustees. But if you insist on pursuing fantasies, you will find yourself on the wrong side of a defamation suit with very expensive consequences." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. Then, quite unexpectedly, he smiled. "I accept." Grange blinked. "You—" "What?" Holmes nodded. "I accept your offer to review your personal papers. I trust you will provide full access to your accounts, letters, and travel records, particularly those from the months surrounding the 2 aforementioned coincidences. And while you're assembling them, you won't object if I speak to your banker, Mr. Pevensey, and inquire about a particular wire transfer made in June of last year, just after the steward's death." Grange's mask faltered. For a moment, just a flicker, the polish cracked. Then he drew in a breath, composed himself, and turned away. "I'll need time," he said. "Of course," Holmes replied. "But not too much. The dead, Mr. Grange, are famously impatient." We left the Albion without another word, stepping out into the weak afternoon sun. I could see the tension in Holmes's jaw even as he kept his stride steady. "He's rattled," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "He's dangerous. Desperate men with reputations to protect always are, and now that he knows the diary still exists, he will not wait long before trying again." "And what if he finds Linwood first?" That is why we are not returning to Baker Street." He led us quickly to a telegraph office 2 streets over. There he scribbled a message and handed it to the clerk. "To Linwood?" I asked. "No," he said, watching the operator transmit the code. "To Miss Kenworthy. I've instructed her to remove herself at once from Bloomsbury and take refuge with friends in Finchley. Linwood will be alerted separately. We'll assign someone from Scotland Yard to guard his office tonight. Lestrade, if he can be shamed into it. Meanwhile, I want us at Highgate." I blinked. "Highgate?" Holmes turned to me, and the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. "Yes, Watson. We are going back to the tomb. The final page of that diary was torn out deliberately, and unless I miss my guess, it was not by Grange. There's a detail in Mrs. Ashcroft's own plan that eludes us still. Something she placed, something she concealed, trusting no one. And I intend to find it." Within the hour, we were ascending the shadowed lanes of Highgate once more, the trees now bare against the sky, like ancient bones rattling in their sockets. The mausoleums were as silent as before, though this time the Ashcroft tomb did not appear entirely still. The gate was open. Holmes raised a hand, stopping me. He stepped forward with a caution rare even for him, eyes scanning the earth. A footprint, then another, smaller than a man's, a woman's perhaps. We moved inside. The coffin remained untouched, but beside it, nestled behind the low pedestal where candles had once stood, was a thin black envelope. Holmes picked it up slowly. It bore no seal. Inside, folded crisply, was a single sheet of parchment, and on it, in the same sharp hand as the diary, a final sentence. He always feared the water. I made sure it was waiting for him. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Sir, not suicide, not an accident. She orchestrated the steward's death herself." I stared at the line. "But why?" "She claimed he warned her." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. She believed he was betraying her. Perhaps he accepted a bribe from Grange and then grew frightened, tried to reverse course. But by then, she no longer trusted anyone. She drowned a man to protect a secret, and then feared her soul too much to live with it." He looked up at me, eyes solemn. "This case may yet reveal a murderer, but it has already revealed a confession." And outside the tomb, the wind stirred the leaves like whispers in the dark. We stood in the hollow silence of the Ashcroft tomb for a long moment, the parchment in Holmes's hand trembling slightly from the breath of cold that rolled through the crypt. The words upon it. He always feared the water. I made sure it was waiting for him. Had altered the shape of the case. What had been, until now, a pursuit of fraud and concealed testament had become a revelation of a darker nature. Holmes read the line again, more softly this time, as if weighing it against all he had inferred of Mrs. Ashcroft's mind. Then he folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "We were wrong, Watson," he said at last. "Not about Grange. He remains a scoundrel with blood on his ambitions, but Mrs. Ashcroft, she was no passive figure in this web. She struck first." I drew back. "You believe she drowned the steward?" "I believe she believed she had no choice," Holmes said grimly. "And what's more, I think the diary never contained this final page. She tore it out herself, hid it here, a confession too damning for the eyes of her solicitor, her companion, or the law. But why leave it here at all?" Holmes cast a look around the tomb, his gaze scanning the shadowed recesses and the dust-lined crevices of stone. "Because she hoped someone would find it, someone who would understand, or someone who would need to. It was not meant for Grange. It was meant for the one who came after him. Perhaps us, perhaps no one. But she couldn't bear to take it to the grave completely." We stepped outside into the waning light of late afternoon. A pale sun hovered like a faded coin above the rooftops of London. Holmes drew his coat tighter. "We have one more stop before nightfall," he said. "And where to now?" I asked, following him toward the cemetery gates. Pevensey, Holmes said, his voice clipped. The banker. The name struck like a bell. Mr. Julian Pevensey, the shadowy figure mentioned only in passing in the diary, had until now lingered at the periphery of the affair. A whisper over port, a name exchanged in silence between conspirators. Holmes had let it lie until now, but I could see that the moment had come to pull back the curtain. We arrived at the offices of Pevensey and Lowbridge in Lincoln's Inn Fields as the sun began its descent behind the chimneys. The building was a grand affair, panelled in polished walnut, with green glass lamps casting an opulent hush over the outer hall. A clerk, all cuffs and chin, attempted to intercept us, but Holmes brushed him aside with an imperious glance and a muttered name that halted the young man mid-step. "Tell Mr. Pevensey he is expected," Holmes said, his voice like flint, "and that I am prepared to speak now or tomorrow in the papers." The clock vanished in a flurry, and moments later we were shown into a chamber that resembled a gentleman's club more than a place of finance. The scent of aged brandy and Persian tobacco lingered in the air. Julian Pevensey stood before the fireplace, a glass in hand, his bearing more relaxed than I'd anticipated. He was in his early 50s, trim with silver threaded through his temples and a voice that could coax loyalty from stone. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand, "and the ever-faithful Dr. Watson, I confess I've expected you for some time." Holmes ignored the gesture. "Then let us not waste yours. You were Lord Ashcroft's financial advisor, and for a time you handled his estate jointly with Mr. Grange." "Before Lord Ashcroft's passing, yes," Pevensey said. "Afterwards I distanced myself. I found Mr. Grange's handling of the estate lacking in transparency." "Is that how you would describe embezzlement?" Holmes asked. A pause, very slight. "I have no proof of embezzlement." "No," Holmes said, "but Mrs. Ashcroft believed otherwise. She recorded as much in her diary." Pevensey swirled the contents of his glass. "And where is this diary now?" Holmes's gaze did not shift. "Safe, as is its custodian. But the diary is not our only concern. We have also found a final confession in Mrs. Ashcroft's own hand, indicating that she orchestrated the death of a steward, one who may have had knowledge of your dealings with Grange." Pevensey's expression did not alter. "That's a bold accusation." Holmes's voice grew quieter. "I don't need you to confess. I need you to understand that the circle is closing. Grange is unraveling. He believes the final page of the diary implicates him directly. He's likely preparing to flee." "And you want me to stop him?" Pevensey asked, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. "I want you to understand," Holmes replied, "that if you do not assist us, I will ensure your name appears in every line of this affair when it reaches the newspapers. You may not have held the knife, Mr. Pevensey, but you oiled the blade." Pevensey considered this for a long moment. Then he placed his glass gently on the mantel. "Very well. What do you require?" "Proof," Holmes said. "Proof that ties Grange to the falsified transactions. Letters, ledgers, wire receipts, anything that can be cross-examined against the estate's accounts. You have them, I'm certain." Pevensey hesitated, then nodded. "I have some. And you will surrender them?" "If it brings this to an end," he said slowly. "Yes." Holmes inclined his head. "You've chosen the wiser path. I suggest you gather them tonight. We'll expect them by morning. I trust you won't vanish." Pevensey's lips curled faintly. "No, Mr. Holmes. I've nowhere to go that isn't already watched." We returned to Baker Street beneath a canopy of gaslight and smoke. Holmes was quiet for a time, lost in the clockwork of his thoughts. I did not disturb him. Only as we reached our door did he speak again. "Watson," he said, "this case has become something other than what I first supposed. It is no longer a simple pursuit of truth. It is an autopsy of ambition." "And of guilt?" I asked. He looked at me, tired but resolute. "Of that most of all. Mrs. Ashcroft killed a man to protect what she believed to be the truth. Grange killed to protect a lie. The difference, though moral, is not legal, and the law will not care. As we stepped into the warmth of our sitting room, Holmes turned back toward the window and stared down into the fog-draped street below. Somewhere in the dark, Silas Grange was waiting, or running, and somewhere in a solicitor's office, a red leather diary waited to speak one final time. That night passed with a tense stillness in Baker Street. Holmes did not touch his violin, nor did he pace, as was his habit when a case was nearing its crescendo. Instead, he sat motionless by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the smoldering coals, hands steepled beneath his chin in a posture that, to the untrained eye, may have seemed one of indifference. I knew better. Beneath that mask of composure, his mind was stitching every thread of the case into a single tapestry, testing each knot for strength and every edge for looseness. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, a small envelope bearing the seal of Pevensey and Lowbridge arrived by courier. Holmes broke the wax with care and read its single line aloud. "The documents you requested will be delivered to your rooms by noon. Discretion has been observed. J.P." He said nothing more for the next hour, though I could see his thoughts tightening like the drawstring of a purse. At 10:30, he rose, donned his coat with sudden purpose, and motioned for me to follow. I caught up with him at the door. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To the yard," he said. "It's time Lestrade was brought out of the shadows and into the play." Inspector Lestrade met us with a scowl that suggested he was in no mood for lectures, but Holmes brooked no delay. Within minutes, he had unfolded the matter in brisk, precise strokes. The diary, the missing page, the cryptic confession, Pevensey's belated cooperation, and most of all, the likelihood that Grange, knowing his position now untenable, would attempt to flee before the circle closed. Lestrade, to his credit, did not bristle. He listened carefully, thumb tapping the edge of his notebook, and when Holmes had finished, he exhaled heavily. "I can have 2 men watching the railway stations by nightfall," he said. "But he's clever, may try to go by ship, or worse, disappear entirely." Holmes nodded. "Then you must act before he knows you're watching. Send a plainclothes officer to the Albion Hotel. Have him request that the desk inform you the moment Grange inquires about his bill or summons a cab. We may not stop him yet, but we can see where he runs." "And Pevensey?" Lestrade asked. Holmes's reply was as sharp as it was immediate. "He stays where he is. I believe his interest now lies in surviving, not fleeing. If he gives us what he's promised, he'll be useful. If he doesn't, then we visit him again." Lestrade agreed, and Holmes and I returned home to wait for the delivery. Noon came with the faint toll of St. Mary Lestrange's bells, and soon after, a modest clerk arrived with a parcel tied in twine. Holmes thanked him absently, then laid the contents upon the table with great care. There were 5 items in all, 2 letters signed by Lord Ashcroft in a trembling hand, 1 unsigned draft of a ledger adjustment in Grange's distinctive copper plate, a foreign banking slip marked Cairo, and a sheet bearing a list of initials, cross-referenced with sums in pounds, marked Ad V for advances. Holmes examined each with the deliberate care of a man disassembling a trap he cannot yet see. "These are not definitive," he murmured, "but they're suggestive. Very." He tapped the unsigned ledger page. "This line here, transfer to personal account, is dated 2 days after the steward's death. And this," he held up the banking slip, "is a shadow deposit. Pevensey's own handwriting indicates it. The amount matches a known shortfall from the estate's India holdings." I looked over his shoulder. "So he was stealing from the estate. But how does this connect to the death of the steward?" Holmes's expression grew taut. "Because the steward wrote a letter, one Pevensey intercepted. It was not enough to scare him into silence, but it was enough to cost him his life." He turned abruptly and crossed to the mantel, where he took the black envelope retrieved from the tomb and slid the confession out again. He read the line one final time, then spoke in a tone quiet and resolute. "Watson, we are ready to act." It was nearly 2 when a note arrived from Lestrade, written in hurried strokes. "Grange has summoned a cab. Luggage seen. Destination unknown. Am following. Will signal." Holmes rose immediately. "It begins." We arrived at the Albion less than 20 minutes later. Lestrade's man was waiting just inside the lobby, hat tipped low, coat collar turned up. He nodded as Holmes approached. "Gone 10 minutes ago. Told the cabbie he was going to the docks, east side. I marked the cab, number 743. Holmes nodded. "We'll follow by hansom. Watson, with me." The pursuit took us through twisting arteries of the city, past groaning warehouses and sloping alleys slick with coal dust. At last we reached the East India Docks, where the Thames lay still and foul as a kept secret. We found the cab abandoned near the customs gate. A clerk nearby informed us that a gentleman matching Grange's description had inquired about departure times for the Andromeda, a steamer bound for Lisbon due to depart at midnight. We found Grange 15 minutes later in a warehouse office marked "Private." Lestrade, now with us, ordered the door opened, and the 3 of us entered without ceremony. Grange stood at the desk, a small valise open before him. Papers, a passport, and a gold cigarette case lay atop its contents. He did not flinch when he saw us, but his eyes darted once toward the door. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and even. "Going somewhere, Mr. Grange?" Grange exhaled through his nose. "I had business in Portugal." "So you said," Holmes murmured. "But I think your business is coming to an end. The evidence against you is sufficient to destroy your reputation and bar you from any legitimate dealings in the city. It may yet be enough for a prosecution." Grange smiled thinly. "Evidence? Do you truly think a banker's ledger and a widow's diary will stand in court?" Holmes regarded him with something close to pity. "Number, but a pattern of transactions. A timeline aligning perfectly with a man's death. A confession, handwritten by the woman you manipulated and feared. Those things speak loudly, and they speak to motive." Grange's composure slipped. "You have nothing that proves I ordered a killing." "No," Holmes admitted, "but you profited from it, and you concealed it. That is enough." Lestrade stepped forward. "Silas Grange, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to defraud and obstruction of justice. You'll come quietly." Grange's gaze flicked to the window, to the Thames, and back again. Then, quite slowly, he straightened his coat, buttoned it, and turned to face us. "I will," he said, "but this isn't over." Holmes stepped back, allowing the inspector to take him. "For you," he said quietly, "it is." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes finally lit his violin. He played not a quick waltz nor a triumphant strain, but a soft, uneasy adagio, one that echoed the tone of a case resolved, but not without cost. I watched him for a long while before speaking. "Do you believe Mrs. Ashcroft would be content, knowing how it ended?" Holmes did not look up. "Number." But she would have understood it, and with that he played on into the gathering dark, while outside the city began to breathe again. The following morning broke grey and soundless, a dense hush settling over Baker Street as though the city itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. I found Holmes at the window with a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him, his gaze fixed not on the street below, but on some uncharted middle distance beyond the glass. For a man whose cases often ended in tidy conclusions or decisive final acts, his manner was subdued. There was no usual post-case satisfaction, no acerbic jibe or recitation of overlooked details. Something about the truth we had uncovered, not just Grange's greed, but Eugenia Ashcroft's final solitary violence, had left a residue of moral ambiguity. "Grange will deny everything," I said. folding the morning paper beside my breakfast plate. Pevensy's documents may shake the estate trustees, but the law may yet leave him untouched. Holmes nodded faintly. The law is often ill-equipped for ghosts. He turned from the window at last and reached for the black envelope, the one retrieved from the tomb, now resting on the mantel like a sealed confession in plain sight. He drew the parchment out once more, his fingers smoothing its creases with unconscious care. She killed him, Watson. Not Grange. Not Pevensey. She orchestrated the steward's death with deliberation and distance, and then sought absolution in silence. Not by the law, not by society, but by concealment. "Do you mean to pursue that thread?" I asked, unsure of the answer I hoped for. "No," he said, quietly. The steward, by all accounts, was no innocent either. He played both sides until one collapsed beneath him. I believe she feared him not only for what he might tell, but for what he might do if cornered. And yet she recorded it, I said. Hid the page in the tomb. Why? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "Because she wanted someone to know. Not the police. Not the papers. Just someone. And in her mind, that someone was likely me." I sat back, absorbing that. "But she never asked for your help." "She did," Holmes replied, finally meeting my gaze. "In the way people sometimes do when they can't speak. She laid the clues where they might be found, in the arrangement of her burial, in the diary, in the strange behavior of those left behind. She structured the mystery to reach us, not through appeal, but through deduction." He set the paper down and looked past me, as if watching her descend into the grave once more. "In the end, she had no faith in confession," he murmured. "Only in consequence." A knock at the door interrupted the stillness, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice announcing a visitor. Holmes gestured for her to show them in, and moments later, Miss Violet Kenworthy stepped into our sitting room. She looked different now, older somehow, though only a few days had passed since our first meeting. Her expression was composed, but behind her eyes there lay something softened by exhaustion, or perhaps acceptance. "I received your note," she said to Holmes, taking the chair he offered, "about Grange's arrest and Pevensey's documents, so it's over." Holmes gave a small nod. "Grange will face inquiries from the Estate Board and the Crown Office. Whether it results in prosecution is yet uncertain, but his reputation will not survive. Pevensey is cooperating, though I doubt he'll remain in the country much longer. His name will be quietly expunged from polite society." "And Eugenia?" she asked, voice barely audible. Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he crossed to the hearth, lifted the black envelope once more, and handed it to her. "She left this," he said, "hidden in the tomb. I believe it was meant for someone who would understand. You may decide if you are that person." Miss Kenworthy took the envelope gently, as one might receive a final letter from the dead. She did not open it, not immediately. Instead, she sat staring at the folded paper in her lap, as though weighing the weight of the woman who had written it. "She wasn't always like that," she said at last. "She was difficult, yes, proud, but she was kind in her way, and funny when she forgot to be afraid. She never trusted easily, but when she did so with absolute loyalty." "She trusted you," I said. "Not enough," she replied. "Not enough to tell me what she planned." Holmes's voice was gentle. "Perhaps she feared to burden you. Perhaps she feared what you might do with the knowledge." Miss Kenworthy gave a faint, sad smile. "Or what I wouldn't." She rose then, tucking the envelope carefully into her coat. "I shall keep it, not to publish, not to expose, just to remember." Holmes inclined his head. "That would be fitting." As she turned to go, she paused at the door. "And what will you do now, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes gave her a thin, enigmatic smile. "There is always another case, Miss Kenworthy. but not always one so entangled with regret. After she left, the room seemed to hold her silence. Holmes returned to his chair and sank into it as though the energy that had propelled him through the investigation had finally released him. We did not speak for some time. Then, as if finishing a thought begun days ago, Holmes said, "Do you know what struck me most about this case, Watson?" I shook my head. "That it was never about the diary," he said. "Not really. It was about the absence it left, the missing page, the withheld confession, the woman who buried a part of herself with her own body and dared someone to find it. The diary simply traced the outline of her silence. I considered this and then offered what I could. You found it, Holmes. You gave voice to her silence." He did not smile, but he looked, for the first time in days, at peace. The case of the woman buried with her diary would not fill headlines. No grand jury trial would follow, no elaborate scandal to rattle Parliament or demand retraction from the Times. And yet, in our quiet sitting room on Baker Street, we had unspooled a tragedy woven not only of greed, but of loyalty, guilt, and the quiet desperation of a woman whose voice reached from beyond the grave. Not in anguish, but in calculation. That night, Holmes did not play the violin. Instead, he sat with a book unopened in his lap, the lamplight casting long shadows across his features. I left him there and went to bed. And as I drifted into sleep, I thought not of Grange, nor of Pevensey, but of a red leather diary clutched in cold hands, and the final sentence that never made it to the page. The days that followed passed in a manner curiously subdued, as though London itself sensed the embers of something smothered, not quite extinguished. The frost lingered longer on the rooftops, and the bells of St. Martin's tolled with a hollow resonance that echoed faintly into the bones. Life resumed its course. Cabs clattered along the Strand, and telegrams ticked their way through familiar circuits, but within the walls of 221B Baker Street, a peculiar stillness took hold. Holmes rose late each morning, not in languor, but in meditation. He spent long hours at the table, reading and rereading fragments of the Ashcroft diary, now returned to its oilcloth and rewrapped with deliberate care. From time to time he would mutter lines aloud. Unfinished. Thoughts, elliptical entries, half-formed observations, and fall silent again just as quickly, as if chasing the ghost of a sentence that refused to finish itself. On the third morning after Miss Kenworthy's visit, a letter arrived bearing the familiar cream parchment of Clement's Inn. Holmes slit it open carefully and read it at length, his expression unmoving until the final paragraph, which drew the faintest flicker of something behind his eyes. When he handed it to me without comment, I scanned its contents in quiet curiosity. It was from Mr. Linwood, the solicitor. "Mr. Holmes," it began, "I feel compelled to inform you that a further codicil to Mrs. Ashcroft's will has been discovered. Misfiled, it appears, among personal correspondence rather than with the formal testament. It was written in her own hand and countersigned by a former notary who passed away earlier this year. Its contents are unusual and perhaps of no legal weight, but I judged you should know, as it concerns both Miss Kenworthy and the diary." What followed was an extract of the codicil, transcribed in Linwood's hand. I read it aloud. "To Miss Violet Kenworthy, in gratitude for her companionship, her conscience, and her silence, I leave the enclosed volume and the rights to its fate. Let her decide if my voice should endure, or if it should sleep forever beneath the stone. I trust her with my truth, even if I cannot share it in life." I looked up from the page. So she meant for Miss Kenworthy to have it after all. Holmes was already across the room, retrieving the diary from its resting place beneath the hearthstones. He set it upon the table with a kind of reverence, the red leather binding worn now from repeated handling, the black ribbon creased along its edges. "She never intended to leave it for the courts or the trustees," he murmured. Not even for the police. She wrote it for a single reader, and then left the final sentence unwritten, as though withholding judgment until she herself could no longer cast it. And what does Miss Kenworthy intend to do with it now? Holmes's fingers paused on the spine. That, he said, is what I mean to discover. By midday we were once more walking the familiar pavements of Bloomsbury, the brittle frost crunching beneath our boots. The curtains at number 9 were drawn, but a faint light glimmered behind the second-story windows. Holmes rang the bell with the precision of a man already predicting the answer. Miss Kenworthy opened the door herself. She wore a housecoat of simple wool, her expression calm but shadowed. She greeted us with a quiet nod, then stepped aside without question. Holmes followed her into the sitting room, where the fire burned low, and the air held a faint trace of lavender ink and extinguished candles. "I received the letter from Linwood," she said. "I suppose you did as well." Holmes inclined his head. "I thought it prudent to visit." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Would you like to see it?" "I would," Holmes said. From a drawer in the escritoire, she withdrew the red leathered diary, identical in every way to the one Holmes had studied, save one. A sheet of paper now rested atop it, freshly written in a hand I recognized at once. It was Miss Kenworthy's. She handed it to Holmes, who read it slowly, lips moving silently. "I have read your words, Eugenia. I know now what you feared and what you did, and I cannot say it was right. But I know it was real. Your pain, your loneliness, your conviction. I shall not publish your diary. Not yet. Not for the public. But I shall keep it and I shall write beside it. Not as a rebuttal, not as a defense, as a continuation. If we must be haunted by what we do, let it be in full sentences." Holmes folded the page with deliberate care and returned it to her hand. There was no speech, no inquiry, only a shared understanding that some decisions are best made in silence. "I always thought I would write a novel one day," Miss Kenworthy said quietly. "Instead, I find myself writing to a ghost." Holmes stood. The most honest books often begin that way. She met his gaze. "Thank you for finding the truth and for leaving part of it behind." We took our leave soon after, stepping back into the pale afternoon. Holmes walked without speaking for several blocks until the steeple of St. George's rose beside us, its bells sounding faintly in the crisp air. "She will keep the diary safe," he said at last. I nodded. "Do you regret not placing it in the hands of the police?" Holmes gave a slight, humorless smile. "No institution could weigh it properly. The law understands theft and murder, not grief disguised as vengeance. Let it rest with someone who knew her." The wind shifted, cold and clean, and we turned back toward Baker Street. As we crossed a bridge above the River Fleet, Holmes paused, gazing down at the sluggish waters below. "I've often said, Watson, that I trust reason above all," he said. "But this case, it has shown me that reason alone is never the whole measure of a soul." He drew his coat tighter, then looked to the east, where the sky had begun to change, not brightening, but releasing its gray into something softer. "Come," he said. "There's still warmth in the fire, and I suspect Mrs. Hudson has just taken a pie from the oven. Even haunted men must eat." We walked on, side by side, and though the city behind us continued its tireless churn, its thieves and bankers and silent widows moving through the machinery of smoke and cobblestone, there was, for that moment, a kind of hush, the kind left not by silence, but by understanding. That evening in Baker Street was quieter than most. Not the watchful quiet of a case still unfolding, nor the brittle quiet that followed defeat or frustration, but a contemplative stillness, as though even Holmes himself were, allowing the dust to settle, for once, without attempting to analyze its pattern. The fire hissed softly in the grate. Outside, the city continued its endless murmur, but within the walls of our sitting room, time moved more gently. I read for a while without taking in much of what lay on the page, my thoughts drifting toward Miss Kenworthy's final note, the codicil, and the question Holmes had left unspoken in her presence. What, truly, were we to do with knowledge that neither vindicated nor condemned, but merely clarified? In this business of crime and consequence, we had grown accustomed to resolution, not always justice, but at least finality. Yet this case had left something askew in its wake, like a painting deliberately tilted a few degrees too far. Holmes sat by the window, unmoving, a shadow against the glass. I saw his reflection more clearly than his face. The outline of his brow, the long fingers steepled together just beneath his nose, the lean silhouette made indistinct by a trick of lamplight and fog. "You're thinking about her again," I said at last. He didn't turn. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" "No," I said. "Miss Kenworthy." Holmes did not reply at once, but the silence was confirmation enough. "She reminds me of someone," he said finally, voice low. "Not anyone I've met, but perhaps someone I might have, if time and temperament were different." I let the remark hang in the air, uncertain whether it invited elaboration or merely served as a punctuation to his solitude. Holmes rarely spoke in personal terms, and when he did, it was with a restraint that bordered on reverence. He turned then and returned to his chair, his gait unhurried. The diary, still wrapped and tied, remained on the mantel, its presence acknowledged but undisturbed. "It was never meant to be read by many," he said. "It was constructed like a lockbox, not of metal but of prose. She embedded her guilt into it with precision and clarity, but she buried the key. She feared herself in the end," I said, "not the consequences, not even Grange." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. She feared what she had become to preserve what she loved, and once that transformation was complete, she could no longer find her way back." There was a long pause. The logs in the fireplace gave a reluctant pop. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe she would have wanted you to forgive her?" He looked into the fire, the orange glow playing across the sharp lines of his cheek. "No," he said simply, "but I believe she wanted to be understood." It was then, just past 9, that a knock sounded on the downstairs door. Not hurried, but firm. Mrs. Hudson answered it, and after a moment of muffled conversation, her steps ascended to us. She opened the sitting-room door with a cautious expression. "There's a gentleman, sir," she said to Holmes. "Says it's urgent. He's not from the yard, but he carries a note from Inspector Lestrade." Holmes rose at once. "Show him in." The man who entered was in his early 30s, with pale skin, dark hair flattened by rain, and a nervousness that clung to him like damp wool. He held his hat in both hands and glanced about the room with the eyes of a man unsure whether he was entering a sanctuary or a trap. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Thomas Bexley. I work with Mr. Pevensey, or did. I was his junior clerk." Holmes gestured to the armchair across from him. "Sit, Mr. Bexley, and speak plainly." The young man sat with clear reluctance, casting a furtive glance at the mantelpiece as though the red diary might leap open and accuse him. "I didn't know anything at first," he began. "Only bits, receipts, delays, then adjustments. Most of it looked like the usual creative accounting. Every house of finance dances around the margins, Mr. Holmes. It's the music they play for one another. But this dance," Holmes said, "ended in death." Bexley nodded slowly. "I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a document. Something Pevensey made me transcribe. A letter, not formal. More like an instruction. It detailed a payment to a third party, anonymized through several institutions. I thought it was another minor evasion, but it matched the date of the steward's disappearance, and the account, well, it was drawn from a fund Mr. Grange controlled directly." "Why are you coming forward now?" I asked. Bexley exhaled shakily. Because Pevensey is gone, left the country yesterday. He boarded a packet ship for Trieste under a false name. I saw the reservation myself. He left the ledger behind. Must have forgotten it in the rush. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And the document? Bexley reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of aged vellum, careful not to touch the ink. Holmes took it, unfolded it on the table, and read it in silence. When he finished, he tapped one line near the bottom. This, ensure ferry arrangements are confirmed. Storm forecast creates ideal delay window. That is the steward's death. Not just covered, but planned. And this? I asked, gesturing to the signature. An alias, Bexley said. But Pevensey's hand. I'd stake my life on it. You already have, Holmes said grimly. The document, while not definitive, added one final weight to the balance of guilt. Pevensey may not have held the drowning man's coat, but he'd arranged the water to be there. He was the architect, if not the executioner. Holmes stood. Mr. Bexley, you will remain available to the Crown. I trust you understand the importance of your testimony. The clerk nodded. I've written my affidavit already. Lestrade will have it by morning. When he had gone, the silence returned. But it was different now. Sharpened, balanced. Holmes took up the diary and placed it back within the drawer of his desk. So the circle closes. Not with an arrest, but with abandonment. Pevensey sails east. Grange awaits indictment. The steward lies in the Channel, and Mrs. Ashcroft remains beneath her stone. Was it enough? I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he crossed the room to the window, as he had so many nights before. It was not justice, Watson, he said, but it was something older than that. It was truth, and for those who live with memory, that is sometimes the heavier sentence. The wind scraped gently against the glass, as if affirming the thought, and Holmes stood still, a man who had once believed all puzzles solvable, now watching the fog and knowing that some answers are written not in ink, but in absence. The morning after Thomas Bexley's visit dawned muted and colourless, the kind of London day when even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. The streets below were muffled with mist, and Baker Street was nearly silent but for the occasional rumble of a delivery cart or the clipped stride of a constable making his rounds. I found Holmes already dressed and standing at the hearth, his fingers absently tracing the spine of a worn book he had no intention of reading. The letter from Lestrade lay on the table beside him. It had arrived shortly after dawn, bearing the terse confirmation that a warrant had been issued for Julian Pevensey, now officially named in connection to the orchestrated death of the Ashcroft steward. Of course, Holmes had predicted this turn. It merely confirmed what his mind had already arranged neatly into place, but Holmes did not look satisfied. He looked older somehow, more distant. Pevensey is gone, I said, trying to stir him. Bexley's testimony will hold. Grange is cornered, stripped of allies, and the trustees have frozen his control of the Ashcroft estate. Yes, Holmes replied. The machine turns. Isn't that what we wanted? He looked up, and there was a strange weight behind his eyes. Watson, do you remember the Ashcroft crest? I frowned. Only vaguely. Something about a silver lion and a compass star. Holmes nodded. And the family motto, post tenebras veritas. After darkness, truth. There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, it is a fitting phrase. Yet it does not promise peace, only clarity. And clarity, once found, can wound more deeply than ignorance ever did. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say to that. We took our breakfast in near silence. Holmes drank his tea slowly, watching the steam rise and vanish. It was clear his mind was not yet at rest. Even with the investigation resolved, there remained something that held him, not an external threat, but a question turned inward. At length, he stood, drew on his overcoat, and turned to me. Come, Watson. There is one more call to make. I hesitated. To whom? Miss Kenworthy, he said. There is still something I must return. It took only a quarter-hour to reach Bloomsbury. The frost had begun to melt into slick reflections on the pavement, and the air was heavy with a quiet that belonged more to contemplation than stillness. When we arrived at number 9, the curtains were open, and a light breeze fluttered the edge of a lace drape like the whisper of a departing spirit. Miss Kenworthy herself opened the door. She seemed unsurprised to see us, her expression neither warm nor cold, but something more measured, resigned perhaps, or simply tired of partings. I thought you might come, she said. Please, come through. The sitting room was just as we had left it, no sign of change, save for a new page on the escritoire. I noticed it without needing to read it. She had begun writing again. Holmes stood before the fireplace, silent for a moment. Then he stepped forward and extended the red leather diary toward her with both hands. I believe this belongs with you now. The rest of the world has its answer, but the voice within this, he tapped the cover gently, was never speaking to them. Miss Kenworthy took it without hesitation. Her fingers closed over the diary like a hand finding a pulse. I've read it through, she said. All of it, twice. And still I can't decide whether she wanted forgiveness or simply to be remembered for her strength. She wanted both, Holmes replied. But not from us, from herself. She could never grant it. There was a long pause. Then she asked, Is it over then? Yes, Holmes said, but the word carried a strange echo, as though he were uncertain it belonged to this room at all. The courts will proceed as they must. The estate will be divided again. Pevensey will be chased across borders until his name fades into foreign ledgers. Grange will be discredited, his ambition undone, all according to the patterns of society's justice. But not hers, she said. No, Holmes admitted. Not hers. She turned to the window then, diary still in hand. The morning light brushed her hair, casting a halo of pale warmth around her. I keep thinking of the last time we walked together, she said softly. Eugenia and I, it was summer. She was stronger then. She held herself like a woman who could still change the course of things. She never said it, but I could feel something turning in her, something final. Holmes listened without interruption. She asked me, Violet continued, if I believed memory could protect the truth better than evidence. I didn't know what to say. I thought she meant it as a writer's question. But now I think, perhaps she was already deciding to leave everything unsaid but written. Holmes stepped closer. You remembered her well. That is why she chose you. Miss Kenworthy turned toward him, and for the first time since we had met her, she looked vulnerable. Not broken, but open, as if she had reached the edge of her endurance and still stood. I don't know what to do with this, she said, holding the diary. I could seal it away, publish it, burn it. Each choice feels like betrayal. Then don't choose today, Holmes said gently. Carry it, let it change you. That, I think, is all she truly wanted. She gave a small, quiet nod. Then she reached into the escritoire and removed a small slip of parchment. She handed it to Holmes. What is this? He asked. She left it with a bundle of clippings. It's in her handwriting. I didn't include it with the diary because it wasn't dated and it didn't seem to belong, but I think it was written last. Holmes unfolded the note and read aloud. Some sins are not forgiven, they are only understood, and if understanding is a kind of mercy, then let the one who reads this know. I do not ask to be excused, only to be seen clearly once by someone who will not look away. There was silence in the room. It did not feel heavy. It felt true. Holmes folded the note and returned it to her. Then she has her mercy. We took our leave not long after. As we descended the front steps, the street stretched before us like a corridor washed in pale light. The city moved with its usual rhythm. Newspapers folded, bread carts rolled, Children shrieked in alleyways with voices still unbroken, and yet something in the air had shifted. Holmes said nothing until we reached the edge of the square. Then he stopped and looked back once. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you believe there is honor in failing gently?" I considered the question. "If there is courage in silence," I said, "there must be." He nodded once and then turned toward home. And so it was that the case of the woman buried with her diary came to its final page, not with a conviction nor a headline, but with a memory preserved, a truth whispered into careful hands, and a voice that, though silenced, was heard all the same. The snow had begun to fall again, faint and drifting as we returned once more to Baker Street. Holmes removed his coat in silence, laid his gloves precisely upon the table, and crossed to the fire, where the last embers of the day glowed low in the grate. I settled into my chair opposite him, watching the man who had unspooled so many mysteries with such grace, and yet sat now as if the work of understanding had only just begun. The case, in all practical measure, was over. Granger's name had become a whisper in the clubs and offices of Mayfair. Shame, disgrace, and exile chased him more effectively than any court could have managed. Pevensy's departure had been confirmed in the shipping ledgers, and his name was now etched upon warrants that would follow him across the continent, a stain upon parchment as permanent as the mark on his conscience. The Ashcroft estate had been placed under formal review by a new board of trustees, and what remained of Eugenia's fortune would no longer feed corruption, but quiet restoration. And yet Holmes sat unmoving, not in weariness, but in rare reflection. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you know what remains most remarkable to me about this affair?" I looked up. "What?" "That she constructed the perfect confession, not in the courtroom, not through revelation, but through consequence. Each thread she left behind was intentional. Every silence, every omission, even the absence of her final page. It all formed a map not of guilt, but of character. She gave us no verdict, only direction." I considered that, then nodded. "She trusted someone would follow." "Not just someone," he said. "A mind she didn't know but believed in. That is a kind of faith I rarely encounter." He reached into the drawer beside him and drew out the final sheet of paper from Miss Kenworthy, her note written in steady hand that now rested beside the original diary. Holmes had made no copies, nor did he intend to. The story would remain where it belonged, in the memory of a few, guarded not by courts but by conscience. "She made a single error," Holmes said at last. "A minor one, but revealing." I straightened. "Which?" "The missing diary page. She hid it in the tomb, yes. But she also left a line on the preceding entry that contradicted her tone. Too polished, too certain. She wanted us to search for what was missing. It wasn't fear that compelled her to tear the page, it was strategy. She needed us to ask why she removed it." "And what answer did you find?" He met my eyes. "That the crime was never the point. The punishment had already begun long before we arrived. What she sought was not absolution, but witness. She had done what she believed necessary, and it broke her. She wanted to know that someone could see the fracture and not look away." The fire hissed softly as it consumed the last of the coal. Holmes stood then and crossed to the window, watching the flakes tumble onto the lamplights outside. "This case will not be recorded, Watson. Not publicly. Not in the Strand magazine. Let the world remember Eugenia Ashcroft as she was in her portrait, not as the widow who confessed from beyond the grave. Let Miss Kenworthy guard the truth. She will write it better than we ever could." "And what of us?" I asked. "Will we leave it entirely behind?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to me with the faintest smile. "We shall carry it. That is enough." And so we did. In the days that followed, life resumed its familiar cadence. Other clients came, other puzzles arose. But the case of the woman buried with her diary remained distinct, not for its villainy, but for its restraint. Not for its brutality, but for the quiet ruin it revealed beneath the folds of civility and reputation. In time, I came to understand what Holmes had meant. That some truths do not thunder, they murmur, and it is in the murmur that the truest things are heard. On a cold March morning, some weeks later, Holmes and I passed through Highgate once more. We walked not to search, but simply to stand. The tomb had been repaired. The gate now bore a new inscription beneath the Ashcroft name. It had been added at Miss Kenworthy's request. Seen, heard, remembered. Holmes removed his hat. Neither of us spoke. And there, among the shadows of the stone and snow, the case came to rest at last, not with applause nor condemnation, but with understanding, which in the end may be all we are ever truly meant to offer, 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 truly meant to offer.